And welcome to today's webinar, all about stress. I'm Trevor Wolf with OJJDP's MTech. And before we get started, I do want to go through just a couple housekeeping items. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on OJJDP's multimedia channel, as well as a couple of webinar tips is closed captioning will be provided, and you can access that in the multimedia panel of this WebEx app. For optimal audio, please make sure that you do have the dial option in which you can use your phone and select the Call Me feature. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please feel free to message either me or companion, Eileen Lafergie, and we'll be able to assist you as quick as possible. Questions will also be addressed during the Q&A session, but please, throughout the webinar, please feel free to enter them in the chat and provide as much context to your question as possible. A certificate of attendance will also be provided at the end of this presentation. For now, help us keep count. If you are here alone, there's no need to enter anything in. However, if you are attending this webinar in a group, please let us know how many of you there are. So today's webinar, all about stress, is a webinar series titled Shielding Your Well-Being, Post-Traumatic Growth. It is supported through the SHIFT program. A quick disclaimer. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Michelle. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Michelle Sipple, and I'm the program coordinator for SHIFT here at the Innocent Justice Foundation. The Innocent Justice Foundation was founded in 2007, and we are funded by OJJDP. We are here to support ICAC task force teams and their affiliates and hope that we can provide some tips for them to mitigate their stress. Throughout our relationship, we have understood the heavy burden that law enforcement officers have to face, and we want to provide them with a space where they can have some tools to mitigate that stress and normalize asking for help. Today's webinar is part one of our trauma series, and we will be discussing all about stress. I will now turn over to our amazing trainers, and it's such a pleasure for me to be here with them. We have Dave and Carol to introduce themselves.
Carol?
Can you hear me now? Great. My name is Carol Brusca, and I'm so pleased to be here today. Talking about stress and tips we can use to mitigate those is one of my very favorite things to do. So I do a lot of therapy with individuals, and so many times stress comes up as something that is either the main issue or something that exacerbates the other issues in a person's life. So if we can give some tips and tools, just, if somebody goes away with just one tip or one tool today that they can carry with them, that's huge. So that's why I do these trainings, because I love it. And fortunately for me, I get to work with great people like Michelle and Dave. But I'm so happy to be here today. We're going to be running through some great ideas. If you have any questions for us, please feel free to just ask at any point. And without further ado, I'm turning it to Dave.
Thank you, Carol. My name is Dave Ferteri. As you can see there, I've been with the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force here in the state of Ohio for the last 13 years. I've spent a total of 27 years in law enforcement, with 17 of those working specifically with regards to Internet crimes against children. I say this all the time, but for all the success that we've had as a task force, Where we failed was in the area of, mental health and well-being and really taking care of our own stresses. We oftentimes would, tell ourselves that, one more child to save or, one more forensic exam to go through with, millions of images of child sexual abuse material. And, at the end of it all, we'd have individuals and some of the fine folks that I work with who would just say, I can't do this anymore. And so it's a blessing to work, both with and for the Innocent Justice Foundation as well, because, they've really laid the blueprint for how we go about tackling some of these important issues. They don't spend a lot of time in the police academies talking about stress and mental health and well-being. At least they didn't when I went through them 27 years ago. And so we've come a long way in terms of just being able to talk about some of these issues. And I think we all realize how important it is to evolve, to really be able to engage in these conversations and really take care of ourselves so that we can better take care of the people that we serve. One of the important things that we want you to remember as we walk through this is really just that we're trying to smash the stigma here. Carol and I have been doing this for a long time now, and I think we appreciate, as well as I hope you will at the end of this webinar, that we're all in this together. One of the things that was enlightening for me, at least, when we started our own program, was just realizing how many people needed it, how many people that came to the table that ultimately said, I've been feeling the same things. I didn't know how to talk about it. No one ever gave me the tools or the techniques or the resources to deal with my stress and vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue and a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. So, remember that above anything else, that we really want you to smash that stigma and understand, how we can all talk about these issues and deal with them to better ourselves.
And so one of the things that we also have started adding to all of our trainings is this slide, and in particular, when you look at this slide, we see coats of different colors, of different sizes, of different fabrics, and we brought this, we added this because what we realized is that it's important for us to highlight that we understand that what we talk about from our perspective doesn't mean that it's the same perspective that anybody else in the audience has or anybody else anywhere else. The perspective that I have as a marriage and family therapist is not the same as every other marriage and family therapist. We work with several different ICAC commanders, and not all of them have the same experience whatsoever. So there's people that are married, there's people with children, there's people that are married and having children. There's people that are more conservative, more liberal, every different coat in every different color, in every different size, and every different fabric for every different need. So what we like to talk about in this slide is that when we are presenting, Dave and I might talk about stories that we've experienced, and this is from our perspective. We are not trying to downplay anybody else's perspective. We are not trying to say that this is exactly the way it is for everybody, but we're trying to give an example to put some context into what we're talking about. And if you have a story that you would like to share that is about the same topic but very different, so we will gain your perspective, please feel free to share. So what we're going to discuss today, we're going to discuss the different types of stress. Believe it or not, there's not just one kind. We're going to discuss the differences between good stress and bad stress. We're going to look at the ways stress can impact our lives. Now, when we think about stress, I'm sure that there's things popping in your brain like this was stressful or that was stressful or got something I'm anticipating is going to be. But we want to do a little bit of a deep dive there, and then discuss why the way we view stress matters, because it's not just about the actual stress, it's about our perception of the stress that makes a big difference. And then examine, how do we support ourselves during the stress? Are there things that we can do, or do we just have to suck it up and live with it? What are the things that we can do to make things better for us so that we don't have to really have suffer such severe consequences.
And wouldn't it be great if we could tell stress, hey, my schedule is full, not this week. And unfortunately, that's, just not the case. And as Carol said, I mean, we're going to talk about, good stress versus bad stress. There have been times where, yes, the stress of my week or of my day has rendered me useless. But there are also times where I think the stress of it all, and, I've always said I'd like to be busy, but busy to a certain extent and busy to a point where I'm so stressed that I'm either not productive at all, or in some rare cases, it forces me to power through and deal with that stress and move on. So, we'd love to say that we're not going to have stress or that we're not going to deal with stress, but the reality of our jobs, especially, most of you that are registered for this, and especially us in the ICAT community, stress has become a regular part of the day. And so we've learned to, employ some of these tips and techniques and items from the toolbox that we're going to talk about today that help us, turn that bad stress into a good stress.
So the types of stress, we were just talking about this. So there's not just one type of stress. There are several types, and we're going to go into detail about those, but I'll just give you the one or two rundown there. So there's what's called eustress, which is actually good stress. And so it shows a couple here getting married, which when we originally think about stress, we probably don't think of happy events as stressful. But happy events can be stressful, even more so sometimes than negative events. And then we think of distress. So when we're feeling miserable, when it feels like there's no end to the stress. And then there's the hyper stress, which is when we have so much stress we can't function, and then the hypo stress. So we're going to go into more detail on those.
And I want you to think about, the different degrees, right? I talked about, good stress, bad stress. When we talk about positive stress, or, the normal healthy response to an event, that might be a brief increase in your heart rate. Maybe your focus intensifies a little bit, or these stress hormones become more apparent. Things that are going to, get us to act. I mean, there might be a positive stress when we're out in the field where, that's what we need to, go into fight or flight mode. When we talk about tolerable stress, serious but still temporary, we know that this stress event may be long lasting or severe in its duration. But that's where we need to start, dealing with or incorporating some of our supportive relationships as well. And then all the way to toxic stress, where, prolonged activation of the stress response to an event that's frequent or intense. And in that situation, maybe we don't have the buffering of those supportive relationships. And so, I think with all of the stress that we're going to talk about, it's important to, have those coping mechanisms, but, all of these really deal with that supportive relationship aspect. Who do we have in our lives that we're going through this with, or that we can deal with this to help us return maybe from the tolerable or the toxic back to a positive stress, or more of a normal environment, if you will.
And so again, we're going to go back to eustress, which is stress creating positive energy. And we can think of this honestly as physical stress as well. So if we go to the gym, we're stressing our body, and we're stressing our body to build it up. So if we think of sometimes we need the stress to help build something up, then that's a way of thinking about stress that is in a more positive way, and it can help us to think that we can actually use stress to our benefit. So stress is creating positive energy. So if we are having a happy event, if we're buying a new car, starting a new job, getting married, for some people maybe it would be a positive event if they were getting divorced, but any kind of life changes and things that are positive to us, that are creating positive energy, we can consider that to be eustress. And it's the optimal arousal level. So we are excited, we are looking forward to whatever this is. There's a little bit of maybe a little bit of fear, a little bit of uncertainty, but overall, it's the optimum arousal level. So we're not feeling super aroused where it's just too much, and we're not feeling under aroused where we can't even think and we can't even do anything. And this type of stress is highly motivating. So if we're thinking about buying a house that we need to, that's highly motivating for us. We're excited about it. We're gonna put our money down we're gonna take the money to the bank to pay for the down payment, and we're getting more and more excited about it. It motivates us to make sure we get to the bank. So we're not going to say, okay, I know that all I have to do is drop this check off or go pick up that cashier's check and then drop it off at the mortgage company and the house will be mine. We're not going to say, maybe I'll do that next week or the week after. No, this kind of stress is very motivating, so it gets us to want to do the things that are going to keep that motion in progress. And it's positive or desirable outcomes. So for the most part, eustress is something that we are looking forward to, whether that is starting a new activity, whether it's getting married, whether it is a purchase that's going to make us happy, starting a new job, building a new friendship, trying a new activity. And again, anything that's going to bring us that happiness aspect, that would be considered eustress. And then again, there's different types of stress. So chronic is the positive stress that's ongoing. So for instance, someone might have a job they love that's challenging and rewarding, but it's challenging. So you've got chronic eustress. So that's chronic positive stress. Typically, when we think of chronic stress, we don't think of chronic positive stress, but it is a possibility. So it's that ongoing, I love the work I do, and it does have times of stress. When I was doing a lot of work in the field, working with individuals that were experiencing homelessness and mental illness, that was a lot of eustress, and it was chronic because every day was rewarding, and yet it was also very stressful. Acute stress, this could be the adrenaline rush that you get after you run or do a workout, or it's the adrenaline rush that you get when you know something is coming up, your first day on a new job, when you're getting prepared. Anytime that it's that boost, that burst, that sudden burst of good positive feelings when you've got some of the positive stress. And then distress. So distress doesn't even sound as good as eustress. It is absolutely the potentially negative outcome. So we can have something that we're not looking forward to, and it's putting us in distress. Maybe it is that maybe it's a divorce that we're not looking forward to. So that's going to be the distress, because we know that with that we're going to have to buy a new house because we can't stand the house we're in. So that can take that positive thing of buying a new house and then turn it into a distress of a negative thing. So every thing we can think of typically will have a eustress side and a distress side. Going to the gym, maybe I'm going to the gym because I realized I need to lose 20 pounds. That's very different from me excited about going to the gym because I want to build up my strength. And so it's the potentially negative outcome. That's the distress. It doesn't result in something positive. And it can have long-term detrimental impacts. So it's the thing that we dread. It's the thing that we go into knowing that it's not something we want, but maybe it's inevitable. Maybe it's something that we just have to get through.
And I mean, Carol, we see that every day in terms of what we do from an ICAC standpoint, especially with our forensic examiners whose entire 8-hour day is reviewing contraband material or electronic evidence that deals with contraband material. As an examiner, and I spent some time as an examiner for a few years, and I would know that, opening up that file or that evidence was going to expose me to contraband material, child abuse material, 9 times out of 10. And so, as much as you prepared for it, you knew that you knew there was a negative outcome there in the sense of what you were about to see, even though you might tell yourself, here's why I'm doing this, or it's for the greater good. And at some point, there's going to be an offender that I can arrest or charge. And, but that positive outcome was hard to see amidst all of the material that we were being exposed to. And yeah, we have some examiners that do that day in and day out for 5-10 years of their career. So we're constantly talking to them about the breaks and the wellness activities and the things that they can do to minimize that that stress or that exposure to that distress.
Right. And so, again, just like eustress, it has this distress can be chronic or acute, and it can also be episodic. So chronic would be the consistent and unavoidable. That could be something that we're in a job that we're unhappy. And so we're going to work, and we are not happy with our job, and it feels like it saps all the energy out of us, and yet we're 2 years out from retirement, and so leaving the job isn't really an option. So it's chronic distress. We don't like what we're doing. It makes us feel like we have no energy left. We don't really necessarily like our coworkers, and we drag ourselves into the office in distress every day. Acute would be uncomfortable but short term. So maybe acute is something like we're at work and our boss that we really like is on vacation for 3 weeks, and the second is in charge, and we don't get along with that person at all. So it's uncomfortable but short term. So we've got somebody that we don't really care for, that we have to work for, that we know it's going to be a distress. We know we're not going to enjoy the time. We know we're not going to be as productive because this person goes out of their way to make our life difficult. But we also know that it's short term. And then episodic can be small issues that feel incredibly large, and it's intense stress. So it can be really intense stress, but it's not all the fun. So it's someone might just miss a deadline at work, and then they have an oversized reaction about that. They get really upset. Or if you're working on a case and something goes wrong, then it feels like it's even larger than it was. Or this can happen at home as well. So maybe at home, somebody was supposed to pick up the dry cleaning and they didn't get the dry cleaning, and then it feels like it's a huge issue. I'm in distress because I wanted to wear that dress on Friday and I wanted to have it in the house today because I want to make sure it's ready, even though I might be able to pick it up a couple days later. My partner was supposed to pick it up for me, and now I'm really distressed. So it's a small issue that feels incredibly large at the time. And oftentimes we have this type of stress when we already have other things in our life that are stressing us out. So it's kind of like the straw that breaks the camel's back. So episodic stress is more like we're under a lot of pressure, under a lot of stress. So any new stress feels giant, even though if we had perspective and even though if we had some space from it, it wouldn't necessarily feel that way at all.
Yeah, and I think, you've got a wide range of distress here, right? From constant and unavoidable to uncomfortable and short term. One of the things we've tried to do with our folks is just, encourage them, as I said at the beginning of all this, to just talk about it. Because, if your stress is starting with just the drive to work, which, I live in a big city and there's traffic. Some days there's no stress. Other days there's a lot of stress, and I deal with that coming and going. But if I start to, build that stress upon other stresses at work or with my coworkers or, even with the job that I'm assigned to do, because unfortunately it's the only job I can do from an investigative standpoint. I have no outlet other than internet crimes against children. When those stresses start to build, if I'm not talking about them, if I'm not dealing with them as they happen, then what's might be uncomfortable but short term suddenly becomes chronic, or it suddenly becomes something that I'm dealing with all the time. So that's really the importance of why we're trying to get folks to talk about it. When I can tell that somebody is not having a good day here, my first question to them is, hey, how are you? Are you doing okay? Because I'm hoping that they then want to talk about some of these stresses that they're encountering, so that we can avoid getting to some of those worst parts of that stress.
And there's a part 3 of distress. Distress has plenty of parts. So there's several different types of distress. There's encounter stress, anticipatory stress, situational stress, and time stress. So what does encounter stress mean? If you look at it just from the way it sounds, it's we have to encounter people that we don't really want to deal with or that we don't like. And it could be that there's somebody at the office, when I say that you have to deal with somebody that you don't like or you don't want to, there's probably people that pop into your head. For some people, maybe it's somebody at the office. For some people, it might be an in-law, or maybe it's a sibling, or maybe it's somebody else in our life that is just every time we have to see them, it causes us stress. And we know that we cannot get out of seeing them, right? So we can't just say, well, I'm just not going to see it. We can't just not go to our job, or we can't just not attend family functions. We still have to continue to do that, even though it might be really stressful. So that would be encounter stress. And then there's anticipatory stress. So that's, again, pretty simple to figure out. It's the stress that we experience when we're anticipating something. So is it something that we're going to have to get on a plane and we're afraid of the plane? Or is it something where we've got the deadline coming up, and that's the anticipatory stress? Is it a meeting with somebody that we've got that we don't want to have? So any kind of stress that we can imagine that is something that's going to make us distressed, and we're anticipating that's going to happen. It could be I am anticipating a doctor's appointment. I'm anticipating a dentist appointment. I'm anticipating anything that's going to cause us stress due to anticipation. Obviously, that's anticipatory. Situational stress. So that's a kind of anxiety or stress that happens only in a particular situation. So maybe you have a child who's going to school and they love school except when it comes time for a test. And whenever they have to have a test, it causes them to have situational stress. Or maybe you are in your work, you love your work, but you have situational stress when you have to go to speak in court. Or maybe you love spending time with your family, but it's very stressful when you get together for the holidays and the expectation is you're going to cook. And so the situational stress is I have to be in charge of all this. And even though I love spending time with my family and friends, situational stress, the holidays are the situational stress. And then time stress as well. So you worry about the number of things that you have to do, and you feel that you'll fail to achieve something. So it's this, oh my gosh, I've got so much to do, so little time. And then what happens there is oftentimes we are so focused on the worry and the stress of that we're kind of stuck in inertia, and we don't move forwards and we don't move backwards. We just sit there, and that makes things even worse.
And that's why vacations are so wonderful, right, Carol? Because, I mean, when you think about, you're not encountering anyone that brings you stress. You're not anticipating any of the issues that you normally anticipate. You have no worry about time or being in certain situations. And so, I'm trying to take more vacations as my life gets more stressful, but ultimately, we have to come back to these stressors. So I wish I could tell you, take as many vacations as possible, but I recognize that that's not, sage advice. But what I've started doing is, because I deal with this anticipatory stress all the time, and what I've started to do, and if you've been on any webinars with me before, you've probably heard this, I talk to myself a lot. I have a lot of conversations with myself when I'm all by myself, in the drive home, when I'm sitting in my office, because I like to try and anticipate some of the issues that I'm going to have to deal with. If I know that we had a bad day at a search warrant, I know that tomorrow we're going to talk about it. Someone's going to come to me, a coworker's going to have an issue. I'm going to try and talk through some of that stress, or, if I'm worried about that encounter, if I'm worried about that deadline, what can I do to get on top of it? What can I do to anticipate what someone's going to say to me? What can I be ready for, essentially, when some of these stressors rear their ugly head, if you will? And obviously, here's the big question, right? Where does your stress come from? I want you to take some time, during this webinar, after this webinar. I don't think it's hard to come up with where your stressors come from. The big ones on here, right? I'm sure financial, environmental, depending on, where you work or who you work with. But don't overlook like social stressors, cultural stressors, social media, right? Where does social media fall in any one of these bullet points here, in terms of the stressors that it brings in our lives, right? People ask me all the time, what would you do? And I say I'd get rid of social media, get rid of the internet in general. As an ICAG investigator, that's my dream goal, is to go find something else to do once we've rid the internet of all its problems. But is that going to happen? No. But what can we do to, minimize that, minimize our exposure to stressors that come from today's culture or society or social media? When we see these stressors in our physical or our mental lives, our emotional lives, what can we do to make some changes there as well? And, even from a spiritual standpoint, we see some stressors, even though I've talked for years about, the benefits of more spiritual or faith-filled lives. There are some stressors there as well. So I think it's important to identify where those stressors are coming from, and then maybe make some changes as needed in any one or all of those areas.
And so when we think about relational stress symptoms, what does that mean? So if we have stress in our relationships, if we have stress socially, since COVID happened, at least in my practice, I've seen a huge amount of increase in anxiety and stress related to being social and related to relationships. And it's so fascinating to me because in the scheme of our lives, we were not able to be physically with people for only, about 2 years, year and a half. And yet the impact is as if it was years and years and years that each of us were alone in a cave. And because of that, there's been a huge increase in social anxiety, and there's been a huge increase in relational stress. So what do those feelings produce? How does that play out? Feelings of loneliness. So if you were not very sociable in the first place and then you spent time during COVID by yourself, then it's that fear of reconnecting. It's the feelings of loneliness, but not knowing what to do because the fear of reconnecting is greater than your ability to overcome the loneliness. It's feelings of isolation. So you're feeling like nobody else can understand. So you're feeling lonely, and then like no one else can understand, and you can't even begin to express what you're feeling because you think no one's going to understand this. No one's going to understand why I just don't go back out there and start going out to dinner again, or why I start hanging out with my friends. My neighbor was telling me the other day that he has not seen his wife, his brother and his brother's wife out in public since the beginning of COVID. His wife is still very, very afraid that they might get COVID or it's getting exacerbated so that she's afraid of any kind of germs. And so that has impacted his life because he and all of his brothers used to get together on a weekly basis. So it's a completely different way of dealing with things than we did pre-COVID. And so there's those feelings of isolation, feelings of social rejection. People are kind of out of the swing of doing things. They're not used to the small talk. They're not used to engaging in real life. And then like Dave was talking about with social media, technology has not been helpful to our relational or social or relational stress, because what's happened is it's just people text. I was reading this thing about phone call etiquette, and it says that it's no longer polite to just pick up the phone and call somebody. You should text them first to see if they're available to talk to you on the phone. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a difference. You know, it's like, and they said, don't ever leave voicemails because nobody wants to hear the voicemail, and that puts pressure on them to listen to the voicemail. Well, no wonder we're having feelings of social rejection when we're not even supposed to actually have an actual interaction with people. We're supposed to talk to them over text, and then maybe if they're wanting to, we can actually call them on the phone, but heaven forbid we actually be with them face to face. So we can understand why there's feelings of loneliness and isolation, and feeling like you're going to be rejected. And then there's unsupported relationships that can definitely get exacerbated by our social relationship stress. If we are trying to go out and make friends, or we're trying to go out and engage with others, and our stress is so much that we can't get out there, then it's not going to be supportive of any kind of relationship. And it can produce low socioeconomic status, which is very interesting that that's one of the symptoms, but it's actually, when you think about it, if you are isolating yourself, if you're not getting out, if you're not engaging in things that will pull you out, and then you haven't been able to get back to work, or you haven't been able to work because of the feelings of isolation and loneliness and social rejection, and you're just trying to scrape by on whatever you can, it's going to decrease your socioeconomic status and make it even harder, which then just adds more issues to the whole situation. So having that stress is definitely not going to be something that's going to be beneficial to you. And then there's environmental stress symptoms. Again, worries about climate and climate change. Not a day goes by, I don't believe, where we hear about climate and climate change. You know, I don't know how many times I heard this summer that it was because of climate change that the temperatures here in New Mexico were so hot. We typically have 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 days of over 100 here in Albuquerque, and we had 6 weeks, I think, of temperatures that were over 100. And so, of course, that's a worry. But then what do we do about that? What do I personally do about climate change? There's definitely things I can do to buy an electric car, be conscientious about recycling and reusing and doing what I can. But is it going to impact the climate when I'm doing it? Certainly I can encourage other people to join, but is that going to be a big enough impact as well? So it's an understandable worry, because we certainly do have some level of control, but a lot of it we have no control over. Pollutants. We're hearing all the time about stuff that's in people's water. In the United States, there was lead found, there was this found, there was arsenic found. As we don't know that. I don't do a regular test of my water. So what's it going to make me do? It's going to make me worry. Maybe something's going on with my, in my water or in the air that I don't see, or there's just worries that come up that we don't have much that we can do about, and that makes the worry even worse. And our safety. You can't go to church. You can't go to church anymore. You can't go to Walmart anymore. You can't go to school anymore. You can't go anywhere without thinking about, I know there was a mass shooting in this location. And so we're constantly on guard just to be able to live our lives in a safe manner. And then extreme weather, like the hurricanes, when they had the extreme weather in San Diego that they rarely have. I had some friends that were there, or on the West Coast. I had some friends that were living in San Diego, and there was lots of rain, and I don't think the whole weather ended up being as bad as they thought it was. But I don't recall when they would have potential hurricanes there. Noise alone can be a stressor. It's a environmental stress response or symptom. And we don't even notice sometimes how loud things are until we're out of the situation and it's quiet. It's been very nice for me the last couple of weeks because I haven't had to have the air conditioner on all day and all night. And just being able to sit in the house in the quiet without all of that added stimuli, I could just feel the stress level going down. And then overpopulation. Again, what can we do individually about overpopulation? There's not a lot that we can do. We can do things on our own, but we have no control over other people. And that can be stressful because from what I read, there's a limited supply of water, of food, of the ability to create food and make food. And so it doesn't look good for the following generations. And so worrying about it is something that I can do, but it's not really going to be helpful.
And, I think it's easy, at least from an environmental standpoint, to, kind of gloss over these stressors. If you live somewhere, if you've lived somewhere for your entire life, um, then maybe you don't pay much attention to these. I'm fortunate enough to live here in Cleveland, but at the same time, I get about a week or two of sun, and then what I would say is pretty much a winter the rest of the time. But it's amazing when I go other places or I allow myself an opportunity to really realize that I'm in a different environment, how much of a difference that makes. If you go for any walks in the woods, or if you live in a suburb and then all of a sudden you're spending time, hiking or somewhere that's peaceful and calm, that's where you really start to see some of these stressors for what they are that, can be difficult to see at times. Um, Physical stress symptoms, these are pretty obvious. At least I think they are, because these are the symptoms that I see most in myself. I have trouble sleeping. I wish I could sleep better. I wish I had a better set schedule in terms of going to bed and getting up in the morning. But I'm one of these guys that likes to go to bed late, and I think a lot of that is just the stress of the day. It's trying to turn the mind off. It's trying to maybe think about tomorrow instead of obsessing over how the day went, or what else I'm going to need to get done before the end of the day. So we see that in our sleep a lot. Um, Nutrition, obviously, I'm a foodie, and they don't call it comfort food for no reason, in that we oftentimes turn to those things that we enjoy. Um, I can think in the last week, some of my stress-free days were also the same days where I was eating healthy. And my wife is a nutritious. She's very nutritious in terms of what she eats. We have time to make meals, prep meals, as opposed to, yesterday was a stressful day. I came home and ate a big bowl of ice cream, which is my go-to snack. And, I realized that I used to do it a lot more. And as my stress has decreased, so too did the snacks and the sweets. But I'm going right back to that every time, I'm having a stressful day. Obviously, it leads to illness. There was a brief time in my career where, I had a lot of stress in my life, and that led to a lot of physical illnesses, especially, nerve pain, back pain. And despite all of the doctor's appointments I went to, I had a few surgeries. Um, Ultimately, when I got out of those stressful situations, it was amazing how quickly those physical ailments cleared up. I can think of recent times where, elbow pain, back pain, that once I was out of those situations, those symptoms almost disappeared overnight. So, sometimes it's changing your situations, changing your stressors, or working through your stressors that are also going to help out with a number of these different physical stress symptoms. Um, Talked a little bit about eating habits as well, and injury. Um, Decreased stress leads to increased health and issues that you're dealing with, at least from a physical standpoint.
And then obviously mental health stress, mental stress symptoms as well. And I know all of us have experienced this. It's the anxiety that we experience. It's the stress can cause us to be anxious and feeling like we're on hyper alert and feeling like when's the other shoe gonna drop? That sort of situation. It can lead to worry, which is different than anxiety. Worry is kind of like the motivator. It's the poke that we need to do something. But if we don't do something, then it's the thing that just sticks with us and drags out, and then we're stuck in inertia. Cognitive overload. So particularly if this is a new job for you, or if there's a big learning curve that you're experiencing in some part of your life, we can get to the point where just can't think about one more thing, just can't do one more thing. Our brain is way too overloaded to even imagine anything else. And then overworking. Most of us at some degree, at some point in our life, are overworking, whether it's because there's just too much work, there's not enough people, whether that's just the nature of our job, maybe it's a particular project we're working on. Any of those things can lead to overworking, which is going to increase our stress. Overworking, then there's a tendency to not sleep as well, there's not eating as well. All of those things kind of feed on each other and make the situation worse. And then if we are on cognitive overload and we're overworked, decision fatigue is so easy to get to. So our spouse or partner is thinking, I want to do something nice for you. Let me take you to dinner. And they say, where do you want to go? And you're like, I don't even want to think about it. I don't care what we have. Doesn't matter. You could feed me a bale of hay. I just don't want to think about food. I just don't want to make a decision. I just want to be able to sit here, and whatever you choose is going to be perfect. Because, I mean, I'm sure that we've all experienced that. You want to go do something fun, which somebody's trying to support you in doing some self-care, but even the thought of trying to make that decision is more than you can bear. And then another mental health symptom, which we unfortunately have a tendency to think that's going to make things better, is perfectionism. And so we get this belief in our head, well, if I do it perfectly, then it won't be stressful for me. Well, perfection is such an elusive thing. My perfection today is different than my perfection tomorrow or was yesterday. What I can do, the best I can do would be considered perfection, but the best I'm doing today might not be anywhere near as good as it is tomorrow when I got a good night's sleep and I'm feeling rested and well fed. So when we're chasing that perfectionism, that's going to add to our mental stress, and it's going to make things more likely that we're going to experience the other negative things that are both physical and mental as well.
Yeah, and Carol, I mean, I would have described myself as a perfectionist years ago, and unfortunately, with where we're at in terms of our workload, there's a certain, I think, bit of that where you at some point have to say, like, we're never going to be perfect here. Like, what's more important in terms of our day-to-day jobs? Like for us, it's like going out and rescuing children from victimization. Well, there may be a day where I rescue a child or our team rescues a child where, the case is not perfect. It's not, maybe it doesn't support an arrest, right? I would love to arrest every offender that's abusing a child, but it's more important that I get that child out of harm's way. And maybe we make a few missteps where, the case isn't perfect. It's not good enough for some reason. So I think we have to kind of, play that balancing act, if you will, because sometimes, like you said, when you're trying too hard to strive for perfection, I think that brings some additional stresses. With regard to the point about overworking, I mean, we're telling our folks, right, like this work will be there tomorrow. It's admirable that somebody wants to say, well, I'm going to put in a few more hours. Well, I got 100,000 more files I have to go through. I have 6 more people I have to interview. That work will be there tomorrow. We just hired somebody this morning, and that was one of the first things that I told them was that, you're going to do 8 hours, and if you want to stay longer, that's all well and good, but it'll be here tomorrow, and it'll be here the next day, and it'll be here the week after that. I'd rather you go home and take care of yourself, have some fun, reduce some of these stressors that you encountered during the course of the day. And for anyone that says decision fatigue is not real, it absolutely is. I mean, Carol's point is well taken. Just deciding where to go for dinner, right? I became a supervisor overnight in the middle of my career, and there were days where I would sit there and people would come in and they'd ask for something, need to decide something, and I couldn't give them an answer. And I would realize later on that it was just, I was so stressed by the job and all of the things that needed to be, decided on that I would go blank. And I would sit there for a second and realize, like, hey, can you give me 5 minutes to think about this? Let's come back, let's reconvene. And I realized a lot of that was just the stress of having to make decisions all the time. From a spiritual standpoint, just briefly, I didn't find religion until about 13 years ago, and never thought it was something I needed. And when I finally found it, realized how great it was, and just how much of a tool it was to help me center myself and give me something to kind of fall back on when I needed it. But Obviously, there are times where, our spiritual lives are stressful as well. We've arrested a number of, clergy and, folks who work in the religious spaces, at least in the last, 2 decades of my career. And that's caused me spiritual stress. We've interacted with people who appear to be, very spiritual, and yet they're doing horrible things to children. So, there are times where you're going to say to yourself, like, what's the meaning in all this? Or, what's my purpose in life? I mean, when we start to look at the bigger picture, it's easy to question, meaning and purpose at times, especially when it involves spiritual stress. We talk a lot about, people who are feeling hopelessness and, people who have this despair. And, we start to see those symptoms come out more and more as we question, some of the things that are going on in our society. So, again, you may start to see those things, creep in as far as spiritual symptoms, but, that's where we need to, find meaning and find purpose. And we've talked for years about, remembering why you do what it is that you do when those stressors start to manifest.
And then cultural stress, cultural stress is a real thing. And I think it's becoming it's becoming more highlighted than it was in the past. I think in the past that sometimes people didn't want to talk about it, and or they just wanted to ignore it, or they wanted to pretend that it didn't happen. And now it's really in the forefront. And so it's something that we all are living in a different way than we did 4 or 5 years ago. So you might experience culture shock, where we assume that our experience is the same as everybody else's experience. And I can guarantee you it's not. So just like we were talking about the closets and closets, my experience as a woman is different than somebody else's experience as a man, is different than someone else's experience as a young woman, is different than someone's experience as a young woman of color. All of those things add layers and layers and layers to us as individuals. And so it highlights the fact that we are very, very, very different, and we cannot assume that our experience is anything like someone else's experience. So we can have culture shock if we, I have a friend that I'm going to school with, and he was in asylum from Iran, and he talks about his experience, and it's shocking to hear what he experienced when he was there and how he's treated here in the United States. Feeling disconnected, whether you're feeling disconnected because you are feeling like you're not part of the mainstream, or you're feeling like you're part of the mainstream, but you're feeling disconnected anyway. Not feeling accepted. And again, this goes to, are you not feeling accepted because you're feeling pushback from generations of people that have tried to do things to other people, or you feeling not accepted because you are in the minority and you feel you're still oppressed, and then not fitting in. And so all of these things, you can feel these no matter what your culture is, no matter what your race is, no matter what your experience is. And again, this might not have anything to do with your race. This might have to do with other aspects of your culture. So just keep in mind that this is an actual stress. It really is, and that it's good that we're bringing it to the forefront right now so we can have conversations about it, but getting up that steep learning curve to everybody has a common understanding of what experiences are is going to be difficult for many, many people. And then, there's the emotional stress symptoms. So when we have that emotional stress, how does that feel? What are the feelings that we're experiencing? We can experience grief and loss. And again, I keep falling back on COVID, but it was such an impactful time in the lives of everyone. And there were people that they had stress, and then there was grief and loss because people had actually died, or because they lost connections with others, even though they're still alive. They just lost those connections. We can have emotional stress symptoms like grief and loss if we're leaving our job. Maybe we had a job that we enjoyed, but we're getting a different job, or we're moving locations, or we're retiring. We can have feelings of grief and loss. We can also have feelings of depression. Emotional stress can cause us to feel depressed. And so it's harder for us to get out of bed. It's an accomplishment if we can manage to take a shower, that type of thing. So, and if we've got debilitating depression, we can't do any of those things. And when somebody just says, snap out of it, come on, shake it off, they have no concept of what that feels like. And then emotional stress can also produce anger. So we might notice that we're much more snappy at people, or we just, for no reason at all, we get angry and we don't know how to resolve it, or we don't know what causes it. And then having feelings of rejection or rejecting others. So it's, we don't want anything to do with anybody or anything because of our emotional stress. Low self-esteem is another thing that comes out of emotional stress. It kind of picks away at us and eats away at us until we might have had some really great self-esteem, and then the more we were involved in an emotional stressful situation, the worse and worse and worse our self-esteem got, and the harder it was for us to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, think about your financial stress symptoms. I mean, these are pretty obvious for most of us. I think the only thing that I've really never worried about in my 27 years in government is the job insecurity. I felt pretty comfortable in the two organizations that I worked for that, there's been some security in terms of my career and my job. I tell people all the time that business is good, unfortunately, in the internet crimes against children world, as is the case with the criminal justice world. I think those of us that are here that are working for local, county, state, federal governments or agencies, we know there's some security in what we're doing because of the need for it, and the fact that it can be difficult from time to time to really mess up to the point where you're going to lose your job, quite honestly. But these other three, I mean, we're obviously always concerned about, paycheck to paycheck, and are we saving enough, and, what's society like, and inflation, and, what's the financial world going to do to, money that we've put into the banks and our investments. And then just unexpected expenses. I think about the time, the few years before we had kids, and how great it was in terms of the money that both my wife and I were making. And then all of a sudden, for the last 21 years, we've had, two children that we've raised, and there were a whole host of unexpected expenses. And about a year ago, I became an empty nester, and I thought, okay, now life's going to get good again. And then I realized that I've still got college, and my adult children still need a lot of handouts and just help as young adults. So, these are things that we're always going to deal with from a financial stress standpoint, because I'm going to go out on a limb and say that none of you are getting rich from your current job. So, can we make some better decisions financially? Sure. Are there things that we can do to, kind of increase our paychecks and, decrease some of our expenses? Yes, those are just some things that we really, again, need to focus on. And I'm just like everyone else, need to do a better job of it sometimes.
And so what do we do to manage the stress? How can we function with knowing that we have stress? How can we function within that? There are some ways that we can do things that are healthier than others. So if we avoid the stressor, that can be a good opportunity or a bad opportunity. We can avoid it by just not dealing with it, pretending it doesn't exist, shoving it under the rug, which typically is not going to be beneficial because it's not going to be something that is, it's going to be something that's going to pop up again later, and we're not going to want to have that. We can also avoid the stressor by just saying, I'm not going to go down that path. So maybe I'm feeling stressed about buying a new house, and I'm excited about it, but then there's all these other stressors that come. Well, I can avoid the stressor by just not buying the house, right? I can just say, I'll continue to live in this apartment, and even though buying a house sounds great, I'm not at a place where the emotional cost is greater than the emotional reward. we can alter the stressor. So we can look at our stressor and then see how do we look at it from a different perspective, or how do we adjust it so it's not so stressful. Maybe, again, if I'm looking at the house buying experience, maybe I'll say, okay, I still want to buy a house. I know that's stressful. So I'm going to wait 6 months. So I'm going to alter the stressor. Or I'm going to adapt to the stressor and say, okay, I'm going to adapt to this by thinking about what do I need to do to minimize the stressor as much as I can to make sure that it doesn't overwhelm me, because, you know, I've got to adapt. Or you can accept it, and I can say, okay, buying a house is a stressful situation. It's good stress, it's bad stress. And if I want to buy a house, I just have to accept there's going to be stress. And so that's what I'm going to do.
And I mentioned this earlier, but I mean, you know, how do we view stress as an opportunity to practice care? Are we able to, you know, when we realize that we're in a stressful situation, pause for a moment and think about the positive, not benefits, but maybe the positive aspects of what we're going through? How can we use this to, you know, better ourselves? We talk about, you know, using stress as energy in a positive light, because the reality here is that stress is not always harmful. I think once we can appreciate that going through stress makes us better at it, we become or have an easier time facing that challenge, right? You know, we've taught for years, as we've talked about wellness internally here as an agency, you know, we've talked about the fact that those of us who are being exposed to traumatic incidents or that are encountering vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, made us more resilient, helped us come out the other side, or kind of return to that normal state a lot quicker than someone who, say, is not dealing with these exposures on a daily basis. I think about that every time I have to testify in court when it involves child abuse or a, you know, child exploitation case. Because I'm up there on the stand testifying to things that I see every single day of my life, my exposures, the material that I'm viewing, the victims that I'm interviewing, the offenders that I'm dealing with. But then I look over at the jury box and I see 12 or 14 people who are just, you know, falling apart. They are physically stressed. You can tell they're emotionally stressed. We had a jury one time that literally raised their hand and said, we need to take a break because this material is affecting us so horribly. And I realized it was the first time that any of these people had ever been exposed to something so traumatic, whereas I'm over here talking about it like I'm just talking about, you know, the weather or last night's football game. So, you know, again, I don't want anyone to deal with any more stress than they have to, but when I look at the folks who are in the trenches every day and they are exposed to a stressful situation, 9 times out of 10, they're managing that stress a lot better than somebody, say, like my wife or someone who's not in law enforcement, who then I'm exposing to some of the horrors of what we're going through. So, you know, I think it's important to, you know, again, focus on these beliefs about stress that, you know, it is helpful. And that when we view it as helpful, you know, we're going to approach it differently. You know, we're going to see it less as something that's harmful and more as something that's helpful.
And we can certainly use nutrition for stress reduction. And it's a great thing to do because if we can just eat a little bit different and that's going to help our stress, wow, what a great thing. We got to eat anyway, right? So if we can just switch it up a little bit and eat things that are good for us, that will make us feel better, great thing to do. So matcha powder, I'm a huge matcha fan. I just love my matcha tea. I get matcha tea all the time. And it makes me happy. So why is matcha powder good for us? It's rich in L-theanine, which is an amino acid, and it's a stress-relieving compound. So if we can have matcha powder and we can enjoy that in our tea. If we can have matcha ice cream if you want. You can add matcha to all sorts of things, but having that is going to be a stress reducer. Swiss chard. Not so much a fan of Swiss chard, but if it's going to help me, I might give it a shot. It's a good source of magnesium. And magnesium which magnesium gets depleted when we're stressed. And it's also something that's really useful when we're trying to sleep. Magnesium is helpful for that. It's helpful for sore muscles. It's just overall, it's good for our mood. So adding just a salad. So maybe you have a salad, you have a sweet potato for a side dish at dinner. And the sweet potatoes are good because they're going to lower our levels of cortisol. Kimchi, which is pickled or fermented food. I'm not a fan of kimchi either, but lots and lots of people love it, and they can't get enough of it. But it's really good because it's got lots of probiotics. And we know there's a big connection between our gut and our brain and stress. And so the more probiotics we can get, the better it is for our gut, which then connects to our brain, which then decreases the stress. And then artichokes are another really good food. They're highly concentrated in fiber, and then prebiotics, which feed the probiotics. So again, if you could have some artichokes with some kimchi, sweet potatoes, and Swiss chard with a cup of matcha tea, great dinner. You just need to throw some protein in there, and you will have a well-rounded stress reduction meal. Dave, are you going to join me?
I don't have anything to add to that slide.
and then that's some other things that you could eat for stress reduction. Yeah, I am not a meat eater, so I will not be adding organ meat to my plate. But it's an excellent source of vitamin B6, B12, riboflavin, and folate. All of those are important for stress control, and all of those are things that as we are stressed, we burn more up. So if you notice that you're feeling stressed, check in to see how you're eating and what you're eating to make sure that you're getting plenty of vitamin Bs. I know for me, and I think partially it's because I don't eat meat, so I don't naturally get a lot of vitamin B. The minute I start to get stressed, I can feel it. And I know that if I up my vitamin B supplement, it will make a huge difference in my window of tolerance. I can tolerate so much more if I've done that. Eggs are good for you because they've got lots of vitamins and minerals, amino acids, antioxidants, and then choline. And choline is important because it's good for your brain health, and it might protect against stress. Shellfish or fatty fish, both of those amino acids, rich in omega-3s. So again, we know that's good for our brain health and for our stress. And then parsley, can't go wrong with parsley. It's got lots of antioxidants. So the next time you see some parsley on your plate at a restaurant, don't just throw it to the side. Pick it up and chew it and eat it because it's going to be good for you.
And the same with, garlic. I'm a huge garlic guy. You're talking about antioxidants in there to combat stress, anxiety, depression. Sunflower seeds are easy, rich in vitamin E, as well as other vitamins. All of these things are fairly easy to prepare when you think about it. And then I think, of all these three slides that we've just talked about, what I found is helpful is just the process of cooking, or even the process of making tea helps in that stress reduction, where I'm taking the time, rather than just pop open a soda, I'm taking the time to make tea. I'm taking the time to, find a recipe, make a nutritious meal. Because when we had kids, it seemed like we never had time to cook. And then now that we have more time, the focus is more on, planning out a meal, finding something that's healthy. Because I'll be the first to tell you, nothing excites me about broccoli. But if I can prepare that broccoli, correctly and maybe, add something to it, and maybe that something is not always nutritious, but it's still better than, eating a full pizza or fast food from somewhere. My wife, as I said, super nutritious, but she keeps reminding me that, all in time, right? Or in baby steps, right? She doesn't expect me overnight to, become vegan and turn to super greens and all that. But, if you're eating horribly every single day, then that's where you start to run into issues from a nutrition standpoint. So, I think she tells me that it's like 80-20, right? Like if you're eating good 80% of the time, then that other 20 is not, it's not the best, but it's also not the worst. So I think a great place to start is just with some of these nutritious foods, then also taking the time to, make a recipe or find some time to cook, and you'd be surprised how beneficial it can be.
Well, and Dave, if you took that garlic and then you made it nice, you browned it very nicely with a little bit of butter and chopped it up very finely, you could throw that in with your broccoli, and then so then you have this nice garlicky broccoli flavor, so that the broccoli doesn't overwhelm everything. And if you go to bed at night and you just drink your chamomile tea, then that will help you transition into sleep. So a lot of, it's not going to be, again, it's not going to be a huge big deal. Have some blueberries in your cereal, or just have some blueberries at your desk that you pop in your mouth throughout the day. So throw along some sunflower seeds and you got protein and anti-inflammatory. So yeah, Dave, I think that if we try to make that little bit of effort to pay attention to what we're putting in our mouths, it can make a huge difference to our stress levels. And then we can also use relaxation techniques. Meditation is one of my very, very, very favorite things to do. I think it's because I started meditating when I was 12. My parents were kind of closet hippies, and so they wanted us to get started in meditation because they'd read something that transcendental meditation was good for your blood pressure and good for your focus. And so Mom and Dad dragged all of us to start meditating, and so years and years and years later, I'm still doing it, and I don't know what life would be without it. But it's been very useful to me. It helps me focus. It helps me stay single-minded when I need to be, and instead of being scattered and all over the place. Progressive relaxation, muscle relaxation is fabulous if you can't sleep, because just the process of listening to someone in a monotone talk about tightening and loosening your muscles, it's so nice for transitioning into sleep. Spending time in nature, that can be meditation in and of itself. It doesn't mean you have to have a formal practice. It just means being out there, breathing in the fresh air, noticing the sounds of nature, noticing how it feels different to be in nature as opposed to in the cluttered city with lots of cars and traffic and noise. And then scheduling time for fun. Scheduling time for fun is so important, and it doesn't mean that it's not good if we have to schedule it. It's many times I've heard, but if it's scheduled, then how's it going to be fun? It's got to be scheduled for many of us. Our days are so full of different activities, and if you're working with a big family or even a family of 4, that's 4 different schedules that have to be juggled. So trying to schedule in the fun is going to be really useful, and make sure they will actually happen.
And this slide here is simple, right? I mean, all it really should say is find time for yourself, okay? Whatever, next slide there. Whether that's exercise, whether that's a hobby, find something that you can do for yourself. I can't tell you how many times I talk to people that say, well, I got to go home and I got to do things with my kids. I got to go home and, take care of the family, and I got chores that I got to do there, right? All of those things will still be there after you've done your hobby, after you've done your exercise, after you've done something for yourself, right? And I think that's one of the most important things that you can do, because you have a job and you have a life outside of that job, but what do you do for yourself? Okay, so if you have a hobby that you're not doing anymore, start doing it again. If you weren't exercising, find some time to exercise. That 30, 40 minutes a day, hour a day will be wonders for you in terms of your stress relief.
And then, try to identify the stress triggers. It might not be easy at first, but if you notice, I was feeling fine this morning, and then suddenly this afternoon I'm feeling stressed, go play back the day to say, where did that break down? Manage your time so it doesn't manage you. The more we can have structure in our day, the more it gives us a sense of control, the better we feel. Prioritize the commitments and prioritize the things and the people that are important to you. And then keep your relationships healthy. We need to have relationships in life to make us feel good. So make sure that you use those relationships as stress reduction, so that when you are stressed, you know that there's somebody that's going to come be with you, whether that means be with you and stand by your side, whether that means be with you and support you, but just so that you don't have to go it alone.
And these are obvious, right? I mean, we've talked about the importance of rest. We've talked about the importance of water and staying hydrated. What's maybe not so obvious is this idea of breathing, right? I have a device on my desk that changes colors, and those colors change every few seconds for an inhale, a hold, and an exhale. It's an actual little device that lights up, and it basically times my breathing, because there are times where I will realize that I'm holding my breath. I'm staring at something on my screen. I'm reading an email. I'm stressed and I'm not breathing. And so when I finally take that breath, it comes out as like a huge exhale. And so this little device, it kind of teaches me like how to breathe properly. And that's so important when we're talking about stress, is just sitting back, taking a breath, and just kind of letting it all out and moving on.
And so here's a 3-minute stress reducer. Now, we don't have time to do that right now today, but the point is it only takes 3 minutes. So what you want to do first is just sit with your body and say, where am I feeling stress? Is it in my shoulders? Is it in my legs? Is it in my head because I've got a headache? Maybe I worked out really hard yesterday. My abs are killing me. But notice where the tension is in your body. And then take a few deep breaths in and out. And the reason that we do that is because those deep breaths are going to get us centered and allow us to take the next steps. And the most important thing is to take those deep breaths from your belly. So as deep as you can go, starting from the belly on up, and then breathe in and out and in and out, and then get up and stand and wiggle. So wiggle and shake. So you're going to just move your body around. You can maybe do some standing stretches. Maybe you could touch your toes, do a big yawn, shrug your shoulders up and then back and down. Swing your arms from side to side, twist side to side. All of those things are going to help reduce our stress, which is going to make us feel better. And then reassess the tension in your body. And if you're still feeling stress, excuse me, do it again. So I love that video. It really puts things in my mind into perspective. So the longer we hold on to the worry, the stress, the frustration, whatever it is, whatever emotion it is, the longer we hold on to it, the heavier it gets. So hopefully today you were able to use some tools or learn some tools that you can use to help you put that stress aside for a while, and then in that process be able to work through that. I know that Michelle said we did have a question. We've got about 2 minutes. I can probably get to this. How to assist my children with stress, anxiety, and trauma. One of the best ways to do that is be a good role model. So if you are managing your stress and anxiety and trauma yourself, then your children are automatically going to learn how you do that. And so addressing it head on and talking about, sometimes there's events in our life that cause stress. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's nothing to try to shove away. It's a normal response. And let's talk about some things that can make us feel better. And so maybe for your kids, it might be something like exercising. It might be something like talking with friends. There's all different things that can help. So try to connect with your children ongoing and give them simple tasks, because breathing is going to work for anybody. Exercise is going to work for anybody. The majority of the things that we talk about are things that you and your children can do together. So don't think that there's got to be specific things for children. Any of the skills that we talk about can be used by all people. So if your child is really struggling with trauma, then getting them into see somebody might be useful so that they can get that resolved as quickly as possible. But regular stress, teach your children at an early age how to manage stress so that that becomes just a habit for them in their life.
All right, thank you so much. Do we have any more questions in the chat? All right, so we can start wrapping up here. Eileen, could you please progress to the next slide?
Michelle is assigned as the presenter. I'll just assign it back to you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
All right, so as I did mention, this is a part of a webinar series. So we do have a few upcoming SHIFT webinars. Again, this is a part of the Shielding Your Well-Being Post-Traumatic Growth series. So please feel free to register. I imagine, or as I see in the chat, everyone's gotten quite a lot from this information, the wealth of knowledge that was shared. So you can definitely register for all of these upcoming events. Thank you again to all of our presenters. It was a phenomenal presentation that you all provided. Again, a lot of insight. And here's our OJJDP's NTAC contact information. If you are looking for assistance or training and technical assistance, or want some more information, you can contact us here. As well as access to OJJDP's upcoming events or their Juve Just listserv. This is where you can find a multitude of upcoming OJJDP sponsored events, such as one as today. As well as OJJDP's TTA 360. This is where we manage some of the incoming TA requests and any of the assistance. You can click this link. And again, this recording will be available on OJJDP's multimedia channel and YouTube. If you feel like you want to share this with anybody, look back on the information, you can access it here. And here are a couple of spaces in which you can connect with OJJDP, keep up with the latest information, news, again, the events as well. And as we close out, I would again like to remind everyone that there will be an evaluation at the conclusion of this webinar. So please take the time to complete that. It does provide us with a lot of information that helps these webinars be as great as they are. Thank you.
Thank you so much.